Hi students, welcome to this class on Abraham Lincoln and Dred Scott. You also have reference in your syllabus, the reading from TOEFL that I had you start the semester off with on what he calls the three races in America. This week is the beginning of a series of weeks where we're going to focus on the 14th Amendment as a kind of atonement for racism. And because we're going to focus on that, I want us to look at probably what is our most infamous Supreme Court decision that we've ever had, which is Dred Scott. Dred Scott actually made humans, particularly Black Americans, pieces of property by law. And it's probably the most evil ruling that we have on the books. It's also one of the most consequential because it happens, and basically once slavery is declared constitutional in this way, the options of people who want to end slavery become really limited because now the Constitution has spoken, right, ostensibly. And so working against slavery will be working against the Constitution, so to speak. Now, as you can see, as I keep going, that's not actually how it gets framed or sorted through. But I'm going to walk you through the court case and then spend a little bit of time on Lincoln's speech that you'll be reading. This is really significant for understanding why we have the 14th Amendment, because the 14th Amendment is basically a corrective for much of American history, and especially for the finding in Dred Scott. So Dred Scott v. Sanford is this case where basically the questions that come into being come out of the life of Dred Scott, who was a slave and who moves into different parts of the nation and who is a Missouri citizen. So he sues for false imprisonment and assault. He sues his owner. There's some evidence of presidential interference here from President Buchanan, that he told the court that they had to decide a certain way, that being a way that was pro-slavery. But the questions that the court is confronting here are whether or not African Americans are citizens under the Constitution, and whether or not the Missouri Compromise is constitutional. And remember, the Missouri Compromise was what had us have some free states and slave states based on their place in our territories. So the holding is that African Americans do not have the status of citizens under the Constitution. And because of this, the court has no jurisdiction. On top of this, the court says we never had either the ability to make, as a nation, the Missouri Compromise. That's unconstitutional. What you're going to see here is we're going to walk through three opinions. The first is a majority opinion, and then we'll go through two dissenting opinions. The majority opinion makes a big deal of saying that it's coming from an originalist perspective, but what you'll see is that actually all of the opinions say that they're coming from an originalist perspective and that they're true interpreters of the Constitution. So Taney's, that's the Chief Justice, his reasoning for Dred Scott is all over the place. For one, he says, well, the morality of slavery is a political question, and we don't deal with political questions, we deal with legal questions. But then he does offer legal arguments. He includes as a backing a sort of philosophical theory of literal white supremacy. He says that he thinks white supremacy is objective and that because of this, the laws of the land reflect it. He says that the Declaration of Independence does not include all men. When it says all men are created equal, it's impossible that that's actually what they mean, given the fact that we have racial supremacy, in his opinion. And the Constitution itself uses the language of slavery, and public opinion is in accord with it. It's in the second part where he talks about the Missouri Compromise, where he actually just comes out and says that Black Americans are property, not citizens. And if you deprive a citizen of their property, you deprive them of due process. This is actually one of the oldest, one of the first sort of examples of due process reasoning that we have, that the rest of due process kind of grew out of. Now, there are two really strong dissents. And one of the things that's surprising about Taney's opinion is that when Taney is writing, nobody at the time, whether they're for slavery or against it, thinks that the Constitution is clearly pro-slavery or clearly anti-slavery. Most of the people who have studied it closely think that there's like potential in different directions, and that this is why it has to come before the court, because they are sort of trying to like decide between this question of whether or not the Constitution is clearly pro-slavery. And the two dissents are really clear that the Constitution is not pro-slavery. And this is, they're making arguments against slavery, but they're also making arguments against the reading of the Constitution as one that endorses slavery. So, for example, in the dissent by McLean, he says Scott is a citizen by birth and by territory. So he was born here, and the territory that he was born in is a free territory. He says that if you read the Constitution in light of the Declaration of Independence, you see that the founders intended for it to end. This is a debatable point, but here what they would think of is sort of the limit put on slave importation, the constitutional limit put on it at a certain point at the founding. He's also really clear that the Constitution says persons, not property. At no point that it refers to the slave does it say property. It says when it talks of enslaved persons, persons. And he also moves in this way that Lincoln moved in that little tidbit I went over with you last week. He says, look, if you have Black slaves, then why not white slaves, right? This is arbitrary. There's no theory of white supremacy. There is no reason for one to be enslaved and not the other. He says that Madison, Hamilton, and Jay would have constructed this to eventually free the slaves, construct the constitutions. And he says, look, it's true that the government that we founded was not made particularly for non-whites. However, it didn't exclude them, because in the New England states, non-whites were citizens. And this is true. At the time that the founding happened, there were many non-white citizens, and they were very important to the states that they were in at first. And you have this sort of gradual lowering of their status over time that we can talk about another time. But in terms of were there African American citizens at the nation's inception, from an originalist perspective, the answer is yes, there were. So you can't say that they cannot be citizens. Curtis has another dissent where he says, look, there's no way that if Scott can prove that he is a citizen of a state, that he isn't a citizen of a nation, because if you're a citizen of a state, you are automatically a citizen of a nation. And he also reminds us that persons of African descent had state citizenship since the founding. And he reads the Declaration and the Constitution together to be able to say that the Constitution was supposed to eventually end slavery. So they're both of the dissenters are pushing back on the reading of the Declaration as something that is not for all men, but as something that's only for white men. And they're saying that it's literally for all men. This is the position that you will find Frederick Douglass takes and that Lincoln takes. And it actually becomes really important to sort of the rehabilitation of the country during Reconstruction. So I included some slides with excerpts of the dissents that I thought you might like, but I'm not going to read them for you right now because that would be tedious. I'm going to instead move on to Lincoln's speech. So one of the things about this period of history that is kind of makes it hard to teach is that at this time, we're dealing with thinkers who are having to defend the humanity of people that we know are human. And so it can be very degrading and very painful to go through these texts. Another thing that's hard about it is that you are reading these texts and they're often written to persuade other white people at the time. So the people who have the most interest in the outcome are not the people who are being reflected on in the text in a direct way. Lincoln's speech on Dred Scott is a really good example of this because his job in this speech is to persuade white people that Dred Scott is wrong. And then not just to persuade them that Dred Scott is wrong, but then to persuade Dred Scott, the Supreme Court decision, not the person, but then to persuade that the institution of slavery is wrong. And when half the country believes in that enough to want to go to war over it, this is a very tall rhetorical order. So he's speaking to the people who agree with him already, but then trying to meet the people that are on the fence. And after Dred Scott is passed, he feels that it's even more important to do this because now, if you're going to get rid of Dred Scott, it's going to be a lot harder because Dred Scott is literally conceived of as being the law of the land. Lincoln's audience is white. And not only is it white, but there are a lot of people there who are pro-slavery. In fact, when you were reading the speech, the women in the front of the speech are wearing clothes that have like signs on them that say they only want to date, or I mean, marry, because I guess dating really didn't happen back then, courting. They only want to be courted by white men. And this kind of becomes the point of departure for the speech because the speech starts in this really weird way where he talks about polygamy in Utah. And in American public opinion at the time, whether you liked slavery or not, whether you realized how evil it was or not, you probably all agreed on the idea that polygamy was evil. These women in Utah were seen as sort of basically being slaves of their husband. There were many of them to one man, and the men would just be able to come to them for sex whenever they wanted, and they had to do a lot of labor. And so the reason I bring this up is because what scholars have shown Lincoln is doing effectively is he's building on this sort of repulsion for what is seen as the domination of these women by the polygamous men to try to draw a parallel to slavery, right? To basically say, if you have a problem with polygamy, which all of you do, no matter where you're coming from, you should also have a problem with slavery. Because the things that revolt you in one are the things that are happening in slavery. And especially here, he's alluding to the fact, which all of them would know, which is that the slave women were regularly raped by their masters. and by people who worked for their masters. And so, in a way, these men who were seen as like these faithful Christian men were polygamists too. So, if these people, well, they were polygamous rapists. So, if these people have this low opinion of polygamists, then many of the people that they know are also doing the same thing, but they don't have a problem with it because the women are black and not white. And he's trying to get them in their mind to begin to connect the humanity of the women who are white and the women who are black to each other. Because if you can illuminate one, maybe you can illuminate the other. You can say, cause them to say, well, if I think this, it's really not that different from this. And here you see something similar to what you saw in Tocqueville, which is that in order for American opinion on race to change, you have to have a changing of the mores. It's not just the politics, but you have to have the people who are white supremacists, who are racists, get to a point where they turn away from that because they recognize the humanity of the non-white person and they identify with them like they would identify with a white person. So Lincoln's doing exactly this, right? He wants them to identify with slave women. He wants them to identify with Dred Scott's daughter, the same way that they are identifying with these women in Utah. So the other thing that becomes glaring is that the court says that polygamy is wrong, and everyone's really happy about this. And this decision happened around the same time. But the court said slavery was right. And these decisions seem incoherent if you're thinking about them in the terms of human rights that Lincoln is trying to use and that were used in the one case. Then the sort of paradoxical nature becomes apparent. The second aim he has is not as rhetorical. The first aim is very rhetorical. It's basically trying to get people who are racists to persuade them not to be racist and to persuade them not by saying, look, it's irrational to be racist, but to persuade them by moving their emotions. If you can move their emotions, then maybe they'll move too. His next aim is rational. So in his next aim, what he's going to do is just give a straightforward argument for the Declaration of Independence, protecting non-white Americans. And he points out that Black Americans had more freedom and equal political status at the time of the founding. So that it had to have been the case that this was a part of what American freedom originally meant, and it was progressively taken away. The Declaration of Independence includes all persons, right? But what Lincoln says happens is that we don't realize that. So over time, we've expanded it more and more. We have from the start included more and more people into the all, and that we probably will continue to do that. So he doesn't deny that we have failed to include all, but what he's saying is it's an aspirational reading. And he also says if you're going to read the Constitution correctly, you have to use the Declaration to do this. The Declaration is sort of a statement of purpose, and the Constitution is like the plan. And if you sever the statement of purpose from the plan, he says you're not going to understand the plan and how it should be implemented. The third thing he does is also rational, and it's really fascinating just from our perspective as people studying political theory. He knows, obviously, that Dred Scott, having the ruling of property and persons that it has, is really bad for the way that our Constitution works, because what happens, that becomes precedent, right? And this is, if you wanted to appeal to the Constitution to end slavery, you can't do that anymore. So what does he do? What he does is he says, look, the court is not the final word. And I think that for us, we think that when the court speaks, that's it, right? That's the sort of end all be all. But he says if that were true, then there wouldn't be no such thing as separation of powers or checks and balances in our system, because there would be a more powerful branch, and the more powerful branch would be the Supreme Court. They would really be the ones in charge. But if you look at how the Constitution's made and you look at the Federalist Papers, it's clear that you're supposed to have checks and balances. So what would be the check on the court that makes this kind of decision? And this is what he says. The Supreme Court is limited to immediate cases and cases like it. So it's true that the decision, since they're the highest court in the land, that they came up with for Dred Scott himself is binding. And he says that's really tragic. And if there were a fact situation that came before the court that was really close to Dred Scott's, it would be binding. But it is not broader than that. You can't say anything broader than that about slavery on his opinion. It doesn't touch it. So this is a very strict interpretation of judicial review. What does judicial review touch? The case that it is pronouncing on and the cases that are very, very similar to it. Now, he also suggests that decisions vary in authority. And this is something he's offering as a norm and as a student of constitutional law over the centuries. He says, unanimous concurrences without apparent partisan bias have a high authority. If it's in accordance with legal public expectation as well, it has a high authority. And if it's steady historical practices of departments are comporting with it, based on what is the historical facts that are being looked at, these three things together mean that a decision is binding. If you find it wanting in these claims, he says, it is not resistance, it is not factious, it is not even disrespectful to say, look, this is just not a settled doctrine. You didn't meet any of the three criterion for settled doctrine, and so this is just a ruling on one person. And it's the cases are exactly like that. And one last thing he suggests, which he gets from others, is that if it's true that each branch swears to uphold and defend the Constitution, so like each branch does, that's a part of their oath. And the president definitely does that. You guys probably saw that on Inauguration Day. If that's true, then part of what has to happen is that if you're going to uphold it, you have to interpret it. How do you uphold it if you don't understand it? Well, they must have imagined that in order to act on it, that you would think, oh, I see that this is my considered judgment on how I'm supposed to execute the law as president in accord with the oath. And if that's true, then it's not the case that the Supreme Court is the final interpreter of the Constitution. So all of this together, I think it's probably more legalistic than we're used to, especially because this is a political theory class and not a common law class. But if we're going to see our class through the lens of the 14th Amendment, we need to know what the 14th Amendment is combating politically and legally. The 14th Amendment has to basically undo Dred Scott, to say we're correcting the Constitution so that nobody can doubt that a Black person cannot be a citizen. Okay. And I think that you can easily see, if you look at debates at the time, that it didn't just include Black Americans, but that it opened the door to later enfranchisement of other kinds of Americans as well. But the 14th Amendment, in a lot of ways, is a triumph of justice. However, it's not one that we see through. We don't see it through to the end. We don't keep up with it. And that comes out when we spend time on Reformation with Du Bois. Um, so you can kind of see it as this American promise, this promise of the new birth of freedom that gets sort of stillborn. Okay, have a good week. Thank you.